Shannon Sullivan, and I decided to do my specialty project on the Pennsylvania Dutch school history. So my major is English and secondary education. I really need a degree in English as a second language instead of English, but Albright doesn't offer that. My plan is to become an English as a foreign language teacher, so that is why I chose to research the topic of when the Pennsylvania Dutch schools had to switch over to using English instead of Pennsylvania Dutch. To give some sort of a setting, late 19th century schools were the one-room schoolhouses, and the picture on the slide is of a one-room schoolhouse in York County, Pennsylvania. These schoolhouses didn't have grades like first, second, and third. They just had kids of every age in the school at the same time, learning from the same teacher, but the students worked at their own pace in their own levels, and they had schooling up until our modern day equivalent of 8th grade. So why was there a switch to English in the first place? Well, the superintendents of Berks, Northampton, and Lancaster counties decided that the students should start speaking English. There was also a lot of tension between the English settlers and the Pennsylvania Dutch community. The Pennsylvania Dutch felt that the English settlers were prejudiced against them. The English often saw themselves as being better than the Pennsylvania Dutch, and in return, the Pennsylvania Dutch came up with a nickname to call them, which was Yankee. So in the years between 1860 and 1880, educators started on the bilingual education. A lot of educators decided that it would be best for students to learn English through someone who speaks both Pennsylvania Dutch and English. This was great because students could learn English easier. It brought their community onto a more nationally recognized level. The educators made it very clear that they were not trying to diminish the Pennsylvania Dutch culture, and it gave employment to bilingual teachers. I find this especially interesting because recently there's a lot of debate over whether or not an English as a second language teacher should know the native language of the kids they're teaching. Personally, I think the teacher should learn the language that their students know, and this part of this Pennsylvania Dutch education history supports my stand on the matter. What is exactly the problem? Well, between the years 1880 and 1900, more immigrants were coming to America. In order to obtain a more patriotic and unified sense of America, English was to be learned by everyone. If the Pennsylvania Dutch had their own community, then the Irish would want their own community, the French would want their own community, and so on and so forth. So to assimilate everyone together, it was really pushed hard to have everyone speak English. So, as a result, there was a significantly less amount of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture in the education system. Actually, in 1906, Albright College, back then known as Myerstown Academy, there was a policy put in place that for each non-English word spoken, the student would have to pay a 1 cent fine. And this really helped lower the use of Pennsylvania Dutch. Teachers all around Pennsylvania had to place a sign over their door that said, "No German allowed to be spoken on these grounds." Though there were some German textbooks, the Pennsylvania Dutch didn't want to use them, and there were no more Pennsylvania Dutch textbooks being used. They were all switched to English. The standard German language courses in schools were replaced with Latin and Greek. Students were also highly encouraged to speak English at home as well. These children of foreign parents cannot become good citizens and play their part in the future development of the United States unless they acquire the language of business and civil life. The future welfare of such pupils necessitates instruction in English to the neglect of tongues spoken at home, said Nathan Schaefer, a school principal. But 12 years prior to that quote, he wrote that the great problem which confronts the people of eastern Pennsylvania is undoubtedly the question of language. It is their duty to acquire the ready use of the English without neglecting the claims of their mother tongue. Two contradictory statements. So, obviously, the people in charge changed their attitudes about the Pennsylvania Dutch community. But because of all these anti-German rules, overall, the percentage of German education dropped across Pennsylvania from 9.2% to 0.64% in less than 20 years. Berks County's percentage went from 24.64% all the way down to 6.45%. Despite the German language depleting in schools and English fastly becoming the dominant language of Pennsylvania, things were starting to look up for the Pennsylvania Dutch community. Around 1900, people started becoming more open to the idea of English in schools, probably because of that penny fine. But nonetheless, English was being accepted, and that was the goal. So students spoke English in schools, but decided to keep speaking Pennsylvania Dutch at home and keeping their culture alive through different organizations that produce literature, newspapers, poetry, and plays, all written in Pennsylvania Dutch. English newspapers were quickly replacing the German ones, but in these English newspapers, there were regular Pennsylvania Dutch columns featured in them. And since there is still Pennsylvania Dutch culture that exists in 2020, I'd say they did a pretty good job at preserving it at home. And I think it's pretty ironic that Albright had that fine put in place to curb the amount of Pennsylvania Dutch speakers, and they now offer a course that teaches students how to speak the Pennsylvania Dutch language. Here are my works cited.